Howdy, folks. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the endocrine system and how that's going to influence not just exercise, adaptation to it, and how it all plays in together. So, when we're talking about endocrinology, we're talking about hormones. We've got three basic types. We're going to have our peptide, our amino acid, and our steroid based hormones. They're always going to have a receptor. So, remember, for any hormone to work, there has to be a receptor, and those receptors are going to be specific to certain cells. If we don't have a receptor, it's the equivalent of we have all of these keys, but no locks to fit them in. And then obviously the actions. What are they going to do? Are they going to influence DNA expression? Are they going to influence activation of different protein cascades inside the cell, and usually a combination of the two? And then the glands that those are going to come from, the hormones they're going to go ahead and produce, and then how we're going to regulate our performance and essentially enhance our performance through hormones when exercising, and how this is also going to influence our fluid balance. So, our endocrine system is chemical communication that's going throughout our body for every single tissue that, once again, has a receptor for it. Our nervous system is electrical communication. It's very quick, fast responding. The endocrine system is slow, and that's okay. And that this is how our body is maintaining our homeostasis. So this is how we're regulating our body temperature. We're getting our tissues to recover. We're having whatever is the normal sexual function we should have given whatever gender we have and are hormonally supporting. And they're going to, once again, only act on cells that have receptor to it. So we've got essentially the vast majority of this regulation all starts with the hypothalamus, and then that immediately is going to activate the pituitary gland. Now, from there, we're going to release a number of hormones that are going to stimulate our thyroid gland or parathyroid gland, thymus, adrenals, our pancreas to a certain extent, along with our sex-specific gonads. Now, these are going to increase or decrease depending on whatever demands is currently upon us, and it's going to be done so by different specific hormones. So let's talk about hormone classes. First and foremost, we have our steroid hormones. Now, when people say steroids, they immediately think anabolic steroids, pro bodybuilders, pro strongmen, etc. Steroids are simply a class of hormones that start off from cholesterol. That's it. Okay. Now, what's interesting about that is this is the hormone that will literally diffuse through your cell membranes, attached to some type of receptor inside of the cell sarcoplasm, or sorry, cytoplasm, or potentially even in the nucleus, specifically enhancing DNA expression for whatever is specific to it. Now, this is going to be secreted by our adrenal glands, both the medulla and the cortex, our ovaries or testes, whichever you happen to have. And then you also are going to get a little bit just being produced by developing placentas, which obviously kind of limits where we're going to go ahead and see that from in the body. AO. Now, what we're going to see is our steroid hormones are also cortisol. That's our major stress hormone. This is going to be the one that actually is going to help free up more glucose, fat, and protein for energy whenever we're performing exercise. However, it is the one that's going to diminish recovery and potentially even suppress our immune system if we're producing too much of it. Cortisol is natural. It's normal to have a stress response. The key is when we have too much of one, then we have an issue. Then we have our progesterone, and estrogen is also going to be referred to as estradiol. That's going to be the one that's actually the bioavailable effective one inside of a human. That is going to be what's related not just to, what gives, makes women women, but it also is going to be important for insulin sensitivity, and it's also going to be important for heart health. And then finally, we've got testosterone, which aside from giving you some great facial hair and body hair, depending on genetics, it's going to give us our secondary sex characteristics. But beyond that, women statistically have more testosterone than they have estrogen in their bloodstream when we're talking about an adult female. Testosterone is a very important hormone for things like bone mineral density, muscle mass, and yes, to a certain extent, sex drive and overall normal functioning. Now, our next classification has two subclasses. We have our non-steroid hormones, aka everything else. These are going to be hormones that are made up of pretty much mostly protein that cannot go across membranes. So they're going to bind to receptors that happen to be on the cell surface, which is going to cause secondary messengers to be activated, and that's going to give us the overall physiological effect of that hormone. Now, the protein peptides, so these are really big hormones, are going to be things like our insulin and our growth hormone. That's the reason why people typically have to inject with insulin, because you can't take it orally because you literally digest it. Then we have our amino acid derived hormones. These are hormones that are just slight modifications of certain amino acids, one of which is going to be our triiodine and thyroxine, our thyroid hormones, along with, then we're going to get into our sympathetic nervous system hormones, our epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, our hormones are going to be produced in a pulsatile fashion, meaning we'll get a pretty big amount put in the bloodstream, and then it's going to come down. Big amount in the bloodstream, and then come down. And that's normal, because it turns out we don't want to be constantly producing something if we don't need it. But just like that thermostat, when we detect there's not enough, we're going to produce more. Now, one that's going to be really obvious with this is going to be insulin. Insulin is going to be released anytime our blood sugar levels are high, and that's going to be typically after meals. So if you're eating a number of meals, specifically high carbohydrate and even that high glucose index, which we'll talk about later on in this class, where you are going to have a much greater pulsatile effect. So you're going to have to, well, it turns out, produce insulin when it's needed, but not when it's not, because if you get your blood sugar to go down to zero, you literally are going to pass out and go brain dead pretty quickly unless you get medical attention and get some glucose in you to get that blood sugar up, because your brain really likes carbs for fuel. Now, all of the secretion levels, once again, is based upon negative feedback. So once our levels are too high, our body's going to start to bring that back down. And just like if it's too low, it's going to start to produce more, and so on and so forth. We're trying to make sure that our body is staying within our physiological ranges. Now, it's important to understand when it comes to hormones, there are different physiological ages for different age groups, different individuals. We do have age and gender norms, meaning we expect, obviously, an average guy's testosterone to be way higher than average females. But what's really important with endocrinology is we often just look at the hormone level, which is equivalent of we're counting keys. We're not counting the number of locks, which lends itself to a number of issues, but I can rant about that and wax and wane on if you want to talk about it at length another time. So how much we have of any hormone in our bloodstream is not really a good indicator of how active it is. What we need to then know is how many receptors. So think about diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is typically a lack of insulin production because of the death of the beta 2 or beta cells inside of your pancreas, so you can't produce enough insulin. You've got a decent amount of receptors, you just don't have the insulin to help push that glucose into your muscle and fat cells. Now, on the other side, we're going to have type 2 diabetes, where you're producing massive amounts of insulin, but you do not have enough insulin sensitivity thanks to not having enough receptors. So we're going to become desensitized to hormones. That's going to be the downregulation, just like we can become sensitized by an upregulation. And an easy way to actually increase that receptor number when it comes to insulin sensitivity, and this is more GLUT4, so that's the transport that gets the glucose into specifically muscle cell, is exercise. Exercise naturally is going to improve your insulin sensitivity, hence why it's one of the first line things for individuals to do whenever they're having to deal with things like type 2 diabetes. That is one of our two cats. His name is Bahamut, and he is going to sing us the song of his people. Hopefully it doesn't get to be too annoying. Now, what we need to keep in mind, once again, guys, is if we do not have receptors, we are not going to be able to take up that hormone, or that hormone's not going to have an effect. Now, once the two bind together, that's when we're going to go ahead and initiate the signaling cascade, or it's going to then go and immediately influence DNA expression, which is great. But keep in mind, we need receptors. And every cell in your body does not have a receptor for every single hormone your body produces. There's a number of cells that are only have the receptors to a number of specific hormones. Insulin, the only places in the body where you're going to find insulin receptors is in your skeletal muscle and your fat cells. That's it. Now, testosterone, you've got it on your muscle cells. You have it in a lot of those androgenic effects. So we're talking about now, once again, to the body hair, secondary sex characteristics. That's where we're going to have testosterone receptors. But you can give testosterone to individuals as you could give, pro bodybuilder amounts, but if they don't have any receptors for that testosterone, it's not going to have really any physiological effects. Now, we then have a third class of hormones, and these are known as prostaglandins. Now, these are going to be modifications of a fatty acid known as arachidonic acid, and these are going to be involved in kind of local signaling, and interleukin 6 is going to be one of those where it's going to help cause an inflammatory response, which gets your immune system to respond, gets you to essentially have inflammation, which causes a little bit of edema, more tissue or more fluids coming to the tissue. So in turn, it's going to allow you to get more nutrients in the area and get you to recover faster. Unfortunately, it also doesn't feel good. So when we're going to be working out, our major endocrine glands that are helping us with controlling our metabolism is going to be the anterior pituitary, so that's the front of it, our thyroid gland, our adrenals, which is the top of our kidneys, and then our pancreas, which is somewhere floating in that GI of mine. And each of those is going to release their own specific hormones so that we're going to be able to maintain our carbohydrate and fat levels during exercise to keep our performance going. So the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to be literally attached to the hypothalamus, hence why it can have effectively nervous control of getting it to produce hormones, is going to release a number of hormones that in turn are going to affect a number of our glands in our body. Specifically, the major one that's really going to be affecting really affects every single tissue in the body is growth hormone. Growth hormone literally causes every single tissue in the human body to increase in size except for one, and that's your fat cells, which most people are pretty down for. This is going to help not just build muscles when you're talking about being a pro bodybuilder, but this is also going to actually help improve connective tissue. This is going to increase effectively bone mineral density. It's going to enhance collagen. It's going to also, use insane amounts, cause acromegaly, which is like all of a sudden you have massive hands because they expand in size, along with an expanded jaw, but you also are going to have issues with those athletes or individuals who do that, where they're going to hypertrophy their intestines, and they can get to the point at which it can literally be where they have to have their large intestine removed due to developing fistulas. If you are very hungry and you don't have food around and you want a reason not to eat, Google fistula. So we're going to actually produce more growth hormone when we have higher intensity exercise. Now, that being said, this is nothing like super physiological dosage. However, if we're able to produce these hormones in a pulsatile fashion, thanks to doing high intensity work, if we accumulate this effect for a long period of time, that's where we're going to see changes in the overall organism. That's when you're going to become a bigger, more powerful athlete than you would have if you wouldn't have worked out in the first place. Now, the thyroid gland, the triiodothyronine and the thyroxine, the triiodothyronine is the actually effective part of thyroid hormone. T4 is essentially the precursor. T3 is the one that's getting stuff done. And this is important for the metabolic rate of all the tissues in your body. If individuals are hyperthyroid, they're going to be super high metabolism. They're going to have a hard time gaining weight. They're going to possibly feel nervous. They're going to have heart palpitations. Not exactly a great time, but you're going to probably look lean while you do it. Hypothyroid, you're going to be lethargic. You're going to be tired all the time. You're going to have a real hard time losing weight. And that's a real issue. Like some of the people you see walking down the street that are very large, it's literally is a glandular issue. Like they do have issues with hypothyroidism, and typically the standard of care in most medical practices is actually to probably undertreat thyroids to avoid going into hyperthyroidism, because hyperthyroidism is a lot more acutely dangerous for health, but hypothyroidism for a long period of time is also deleterious to health. What we're going to find with all of our hormones is we're looking for an optimal range. It's not like let's just pin that thing as high as we can and let's not get it so it's zero. We want to have it typically in a normal range. And I'm not going to reiterate this too many times, but one thing that I cannot suggest enough for you guys, depending on whatever age you are when you take this class or you stumble across this on the internet, get a complete blood panel done of all of your hormones, and especially if you're young. Because the idea is then you have the information of like, hey, here's how high my thyroid hormones were, my growth hormone, my testosterone, my estrogen, my estradiol, my cortisol. Here's what all my hormones were like when I was young and hopefully healthy. And you're going to have the peak of pretty much all of these hormones when you're younger in life. And then as you get older, the levels are going to go down, which is natural, but some folks take a much more precipitous drop for one reason or another. And if you've got the hard numbers, like here's where I was and this is where I'm at now, you can at least hopefully have a good conversation with the medical provider of looking into ways you can hopefully get yourself back on track. So the thyroid gland is going to release what's known as thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. This is going to stimulate the production of T3 and T4. Specifically, we're going to go ahead and get ourselves to now have a greater amount of conversion over to T3. Now, when we're exercising, we're going to increase that thyroid stimulating hormone, which is great because it's going to increase our metabolism, help us turn over some calories, and recover from exercise. That's a big thing. Metabolism, remember, is just the sum of all those processes. If we're going through and we're metabolizing more nutrients, we're turning over tissues faster, which means we're going to recover faster. Whereas if we do insane, and I'm talking like you training for marathons and then some, you can have a situation, especially if you're not careful, where you can start to have suppression of your own thyroid, which is the same thing. Lethargic, you're not going to recover as well. You're going to feel tired all the time. Now, this is not true, like medically diagnosed hypothyroidism, but it's important to understand that if we go too hard, we can negatively influence our own natural hormone production. Now, we then have our adrenal medulla. That's in the inside of our adrenal gland. This is where we're producing our catecholamines, also known as epinephrine, norepinephrine. You guys maybe have heard it as adrenaline and noradrenaline. That's fine. Epinephrine is more of a true hormone. Norepinephrine is almost more of a neurotransmitter. But the key is this is going to increase our heart rate, it's going to increase contractile force, and it's going to jack up our blood pressure, which is awesome if you need to fight. However, this hormone is going to be released just because we're stressed out about work, relationships, etc. And that causes that increased blood pressure while you're sitting still, which is not good for your health. Now, this is going to help us break down more carbohydrates for fuel and fats for fuel. If we're releasing too much epinephrine too quickly, we can actually deplete our stored glycogen levels faster than we'd like to. But in typical fashion, what you're going to find is it causes what's known as global vasoconstriction. So mass amounts of epinephrine is going to really restrict your blood vessels. However, the local factors that cause vasodilation, so increasing blood flow to the area from exercise, are going to overcome that effect. So it's great because epinephrine effectively gets you to really shut down blood flow to everywhere in the body except for where it really matters. And that's where you're going to focus, and you're going to be sending a lot more blood to those legs, to the muscles, to whatever you need to get stuff done, which is great if you're fighting a lion and are running from the lion. Not great if you have to go give a speech. Now, the cortex, we're going to find, is going to be where we have our corticosteroids. And of those, we're going to talk about the mineral corticoids and the glucocorticoids. And we've got the mineral ones. We'll get there in a second. The glucocorticoid is going to be cortisol. Cortisol is another stress hormone that's going to help us break down more glucose for fuel, or make more glucose. It's going to free up fatty acids. It's going to break down protein. And it is going to help decrease inflammation, but also suppress our immune response. And that's where, like I said, if we're stressing out too much or doing too much training, we can suppress our immune system, and then we're more likely to get sick. Not a good thing, obviously. Cortisol is very much so a double-edged sword. We want to have enough of it, but not too much. Too much, and then we're going to have ourselves into some situations. Now, for pancreas, the major one we're producing there is going to be the wonderful insulin that's going to be bringing our blood sugar down. Now, if we happen to have too much or too low blood sugar, we're going to be releasing what's known as glucagon. Glucagon is going to allow us to break down that stored glycogen in our liver, put it in our bloodstream, along with tell the liver to go ahead and make new glucose that it can put into the bloodstream for use. So when we happen to be working out, it turns out we're going to, especially with moderate to high intensities, we're going to be burning through some glucose. So we want to go ahead and break down that glycogen in our muscles, free it up from our liver, and send it where it needs to be, along with, well, we want to make some more glucose because it turns out our brain really does like using glucose as a fuel source, along with we would prefer, our red blood cells need it because they don't even have mitochondria. So what we're going to find is that typically we're going to have more than enough glucose or glycogen stored in our muscles and our liver to keep us going and getting us through just a little workout. Now, if you're a hard training athlete who's training multiple times per day, nearly every single day of the week, you're going to be running through a lot of glycogen, and that's where the amount of carbohydrate you're taking in, timing it, is going to become a lot more important. Now, glucagon is going to help increase that glucose level. Epinephrine is going to help, as is norepinephrine and cortisol, which is why those hormones are all going to start to uptick when we start training, and even more so with the cortisol and the glucagon when we go for much longer durations. Epinephrine and norepinephrine is usually more or less related to our sympathetic nervous system. So if you're really fighting and flighting, that's where you're going to see a much greater tick of it, and then you'll have much higher amounts of it released when you're like strength power sports, but the cumulative amount you're going to release if you're doing like really long bouts of endurance training is going to be probably more in the bloodstream. So we're going to find that it's also going to be influenced by growth hormone. Growth hormone actually helps us use fat more as a fuel and decrease our use of glucose. So that's the reason why some bodybuilders, if they use excessive amounts of growth hormone, they can literally find themselves into a situation where they're starting to look at things like, becoming diabetic because they're becoming insulin resistant. But normal individuals, that's not an issue. And our thyroid hormones are going to help us break down everything for fuel. So it's not so much a preferential effect, it's just going to happen in general. And obviously, the amount that we're going to be released is going to definitely come down to how intense is the exercise and how long are we doing it for. So I like this graph here because you can actually see this rise in our epinephrine and norepinephrine, the catecholamines. You can see that increase in the breaking down of glycogen in the livers and the muscle, because that's why you can see we've got that effectable glucagon level that's massively increased, telling our liver to break it down. And we're going to try to use our muscle glycogen before we start tapping into our liver glycogen. Muscle glycogen is only specific to the individual muscle cell it's inside of. So once it's inside of your legs, if you're going to go for a swim and you're only using your arms, that glycogen is useless because it is stored in your legs, not in your arms. Outside of the Cori cycle, but there's some other little things there, and it makes things a lot more involved. Whereas the liver, that can go anywhere. We can release that into the bloodstream so that it goes to your quads, your hams, your glutes, your delts. It can go anywhere your body needs to. And so as we're doing more and more work, we're having to break down more of that liver glycogen. We're going to go ahead and take up more glucose into the muscles so they're going to keep up that energy output. And we're going to see that those glycogen stores are going to really start to go down. And that's okay. We're burning fuel out of the fuel tank. That's why we also need to make sure that we're replenishing that fuel as we go. So if you guys also look at the graph, keep in mind, anytime we look at any of these, you see the percent change from baseline, but I think what's more important is to look at the time. The fact of the matter is, this is the example of doing aerobic style training for 3 hours. I don't know how many of you guys are doing that, or doing long bouts of exercise in general, much less 3 hours of it, because that definitely changes up the game and the total amount of demands you're going to have when you're trying to do something like this. So the other side is we're going to have that insulin release that's going to help us drive that carbohydrate back into the muscle. So when we're exercising, we're not going to be releasing insulin. However, we're increasing the insulin sensitivity. And after we have a larger meal otherwise, that's where we're going to see that insulin release that's going to drive that glucose into the muscle. And from there, help us regulate the amount that we're trying to store and keep inside of the cells. So what's going on with fats? Well, it turns out the body is going to be going to try to use these to the best of its ability. Now, we do store some fatty acids inside of our muscles, and we do release it from our fat cells as we're training. However, the speed at which it's going to be able to metabolize that is never going to be faster than carbohydrates. It's just the way things work. However, it is something that you can utilize as fuel, and it's going to help preserve your glycogen, so that way you can support not just aerobic glycolysis, but anaerobic glycolysis, which tends to be the bigger deal when you're trying to get that better performance from your athletes. So we're going to get ourselves to stimulate breaking down fats for fuel thanks to lower insulin levels, along with increasing epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, and growth hormone. Now, this is going to be stimulated by literally activating an enzyme in those cells to start to break down fat. And specifically in our adipose, it's going to break down the triglyceride into 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol, and get those into the bloodstream. And then whereas when we're inside the actual muscle cells, that's when we're going to take those fatty acids and now ship them on through the wonderful beta oxidation energy system. So that way we're going to be able to get some energy from it. So we also need to regulate our fluid levels. If we happen to have too much fluids, can happen. You can die of water intoxication. That's pretty hard to do. Whereas individuals dying of dehydration is a very real thing. And the bigger issue is managing your electrolyte levels. That's really how you die of water intoxication. You really die of hyponatremia, not enough salt in your fluids. And so it's really important that the body is trying to control this as much as possible. And when you're sweating, you're literally pulling out plasma volume, And that's really what you're sweating out. So your blood is literally thickening. So it's really important that we have a myriad of hormones produced by our posterior pituitary gland, our adrenal cortex, and the kidneys themselves in order to help regulate this and keep us safe when we're exercising. So the posterior thyroid itself is going to be producing what's known as antidiuretic hormone. This is going to help us retain fluid, as is oxytocin to a lesser extent. Now, this in turn is going to be produced, travels to the posterior pituitary, and then secreted. Now, antidiuretic hormone is, oxytocin is also the bonding hormone. That's a different story out of the side of exercise. Antidiuretic hormone is the one that we're really interested in when it comes to exercise. This is going to help us hold more water, and due to this, it turns out we're going to be retaining more fluids because we're not peeing them out. I'm sure some of you guys have been outside exercising or working in warm weather and realize you've been out there for almost an entire day and like, I haven't had to go use the bathroom once. It's like, yeah, because your body's trying to hold on to what fluids it has, and it's not going to risk wasting them if it can go ahead and just retain them a little bit better. Now, take your time, look at this slide or look at this figure, and really make sure you understand what's going to be the stimulation for antidiuretic hormone. So that's low plasma volume and increased osmolality, meaning we have higher salt concentrations inside of our bloodstream. And because of this, we're going to tell our kidneys to retain water, which is also going to help us retain sodium. One of the very fascinating things when you look at our hormones that are related to electrolytes is we have ways of getting rid of excess potassium and excess water. We don't have a way of getting rid of excess sodium. We get rid of excess sodium through sweating it out. And that's why one of the mechanisms for some individuals that are salt sensitive and higher sodium intakes is going to cause them to have higher blood pressure is literally because we don't have a way to get rid of that excess sodium in our body outside of literally getting out there and sweating it out. Because we do lose a certain amount in our urine, but it's not going to be enough that you're really going to be able to overcome eating a lot of salted French fries every single meal, every single day. Now, the major mineral corticoid that's released from our adrenal cortex is going to be aldosterone. Aldosterone is what's going to tell our kidneys to hold on to sodium. And whenever we hold on to sodium, we're going to in turn hold on to more water. Now, when we hold on to more water, we're actually going to do this at the expense of potassium. Hence why it's not just about sodium, it's also about potassium, because typically that's going to be the one that we're going to be able to give up at a much higher rate. And so this is going to be stimulated by low blood volume and low plasma levels and high potassium. Any of those or all three of those, that's going to go ahead and get our body to go ahead and do so when it comes to fluid retaining and retaining that sodium. Once again, we have ways of holding on to sodium. We have ways of getting rid of potassium. We don't have a way of getting rid of excess sodium. So we're going to find that antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone are going to directly signal the kidneys. But another hormone that's of interest and worth understanding is going to be erythropoietin, or also known as EPO. EPO is going to be released by the kidneys whenever low blood O2 levels are coming to it, aka you're doing a lot of hard aerobic training, and this is going to tell our body to produce more red blood cells. Now, this is really good when it comes to training specific or adapting to aerobic training or adapting to being up at altitude, in that we're going to have a greater red blood cell count, which is going to give us a greater amount of oxygen carrying capacity. However, this is one of those other mechanisms that athletes have been known to abuse in order to enhance their performance. Now, when you look at the figure on the right, take your time and go through it and make sure you understand the mechanisms, because when we go through angiotensin 1 and 2, and how that's going to cause an increase in blood pressure, and that we're trying to hold on to the fluid when we're getting dehydrated with exercise, it's a very interesting but important interplay as to how our hormones are going to keep us regulated and keep us healthy when we're trying to exercise, and specifically, obviously, hot weather. So we have the hormone known as renin. Now, renin is going to be released whenever we have low blood volume and low blood pressure. This is from typically more sympathetic nervous system pressures, which in turn is going to get us to go ahead and hold on to those fluids. Along with, we're now going to activate the angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, which is okay. Anytime you see GEN or GEN at the end of an enzyme, it means it's, or a hormone, it's inactive. So when renin converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, that means it's on. Then ACE, which is another enzyme, is going to convert it into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2, in turn, is going to cause that aldosterone release, which in turn is going to get us to retain more fluids. Osmolarity, if you guys didn't remember, that's going to be effectively how much of different individual electrolytes are essentially dissolved into a fluid. So higher osmolarity is going to be something that has got a lot more solutes in it, and then a low osmolarity is going to be something that has less solutes in it. And so we're going to always have a certain amount of diffusion going on in the body thanks to osmosis, where if we have a high osmolarity layer, area and a low osmolarity level, fluids are going to move towards the high osmolarity so that they're going to be able to make those to be equal. So aldosterone is going to cause that sodium retention, which is going to increase the osmolarity of your bloodstream, which in turn is going to keep water pulling in that area. It's just using pressure gradients in order to keep things where you want them to be, so you're not going to get dehydrated. And aldosterone is going to be something that lasts for a decent period of time. So it's not like you finish and then you're done. It's actually going to be something where you're going to see the holding on to fluid levels for relatively high amounts, specifically if you happen to do really, really intense exercise where you see a lot of this hormonal effect. And this is part of the reason why, if you've talked with some women or you happen to be one, where you can see those changes in fluid balance, specifically with where you're at in your cycle, and how that can really cause a lot of water retention. Now, aldosterone is not the major culprit there. Now we're going to talk conversations more about progesterone. So the last thing I want to touch on is understanding not just the amount of receptors, but when it comes to a number of hormones, we need to keep in mind there's a big difference between the total amount of the hormone you have and the free amount. The free is what's actually bioavailable. That's the one that can actually bind to the receptors and get something done. The total amount it's there, but it's bound up in ways you can't use it. It's the equivalent of your free is how much money you actually have in your wallet. Your total would be all of the money that you have in a trust fund or CDs or something where it's like, yeah, it's there, but I can't touch it right now, so it's not really that useful for me. So when you're looking at endocrinology, if it ever affects you or anyone you know, care about, you do want to understand that it's important to not just look at total levels, but to look at free levels and to make sure that we're trying to assess the entire system. So we've listed off a number of hormones that are involved in signaling for the production of other hormones. Well, some endocrinology tests will only test for the signaling hormone. They won't test for the actual hormone level, or they'll test for the total hormone level and won't look at the free level. And then the major extra monkey wrench that we just keep chucking in there is the receptor level, which that would require a tissue biopsy and then some hardcore, probably more like Western blotting for that, which is beyond the scope of most medical practices. So there's still a certain amount of crapshoot as to how much different levels should be depending on the individuals you're working with. So thank you guys for listening. Stay safe out there. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave a comment below, shoot me a message. I'd be more than happy to talk with you sometime soon. Have a great day.